My name is Elin Gwynedd. I'm from the Welsh Government. Thank you very much for the invitation today, for the opportunity to come and tell you a little bit about what's happening in Wales. So Wales is a country, a population of about 3 million, so it's a little bit less than half, probably the size of Catalan. And then Wales now has devolved powers on all matters except justice, armed forces and immigration. So just a little bit of background there about the kind of country that I work in. I think that having listened to the presentations that's been before, and specifically Anna's presentation, I think it would be very difficult for any of us to argue with the fact that children's rights actually need to be implemented. And in fact, I'm not sure any of us could argue with the UNCRC as it stands. The difficulty, I guess, is in how you actually go about implementing it. What do you do? How do you do it? So it's not if you should do it, it's how you should do it. And we've struggled somewhat with this, and we've tried different things. But the way that Wales has gone in the end is that we've created legislation. So now children's rights and the UNCRC is ingrained in Welsh legislation by the Rights of Children and Young Persons Wales measure. So this came in 2011, but it came in stages, because to do it all in one go and to learn in that speed of time was difficult. So it's been done in stages. But however, our First Minister was very, very clear that he wanted children's rights in legislation, and he pushed and he showed leadership, and he got this measure through. One of the things he kept quoting was what Anna was quoting here, was it's about protection, provision and participation. So while of course protection is important, they're interchangeable and you can't separate them. The measure here is to make sure that all our legislation and policies have a positive effect on children, young people and families, and that we consciously think about children, young people and families in any planning or delivery or decisions we make. So how do we do that? Is it just about a cria, or is it about a culture change? Is it about that everybody that works in Welsh Government actually is convinced of this? It's part of my job is to actually go around them and convince them, and it's not that difficult to convince people. Because once they see the articles on the convention, once they see what it's trying to do, it's actually not that difficult to convince them. What's difficult, and the barriers very often are the actual processes, the how. So the Welsh Government have developed, I'm going a bit fast, have developed this. So it's a children's rights scheme. And this document sets out how we're going to do it. It includes what is the duty on ministers, how we will comply with the duty on ministers. It includes the children's rights impact assessment. We've also committed to publishing all the children's rights impact assessments. Somebody mentioned before about transparency. So if the government is actually completing a CRIA, why wouldn't we publish it? Why wouldn't we put it on, make it available for anybody to scrutinise us? Especially, I think that the way that we deal with CRIAs is that instead of us doing it behind closed doors and we just in a little room with a little computer and doing it, we actually do involve children and people. We actually ask them what they should, what this policy or what this legislation or what this programme should look like. We also involve the likes of you, NGO groups, other people that work for government to make it the best it can be, and specifically also the commissioners. Because if you involve them right at the beginning, then your policy will be better. It's not about actually creating something and then publishing it for us to be bashed as a government, for us to be chastised as a government. We're all trying to get to the same place. We're all trying to make better policies and better outcomes for children and people. So in Wales, we try and involve as many people as possible to make sure that that's the case. So what is the duty on ministers? The duty on Welsh ministers, I should probably just set a little bit of context, this duty is only on Welsh ministers. So if something is non-devolved, there is no duty on any other ministers. So immigration, for example, they don't have to do a CRIA, they don't have to have due regard to the UNCRC, so it's only things that are devolved to Welsh ministers and the duty is only on Welsh ministers. But in fact, they have to have due regard to the UNCRC when exercising any of their functions. So it's not just in developing legislation or developing policy, it's anything they do. So we've defined functions here. So all the things that ministers may do because legislation has given the ministers the power to do it, and all the things that they must do because legislation has placed the duty on the minister to do it. So it's actually when they make decisions. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do a children's rights impact assessment every time they make a decision. That's not what this is about. The children's rights impact assessment sits with the policy above it, or the legislation above it, or the programme above it. Decisions then fall out of those policies, legislation, or programme decisions. So in fact, when you're hearing me talk, you're probably thinking, oh, there would be millions of CRIAs, but it actually isn't. All that happens is whenever a decision needs to be made, you look back to the CRIA, and the CRIA becomes a living document rather than something that's done once and put on a shelf afterwards. So let me just go to the CRIA, because that's actually what I've been asked to focus on, so I better get to it, really. What does a children's rights impact assessment look like? They look very different in different places, but essentially ours in Wales, I don't think is intended to do anything much different to what it's intended to do in other countries. It does two things. The first is it focuses people's minds on children's rights when developing any piece of work, be it legislation or policy. So it makes us think about children and young people in the context of their family, their environment, other factors that have an effect on them. And in doing that, we think, is there anything that we could do better? Is there anything we could do different to make it better for children and young people? So it helps us to think about our policy, our programmes, or our legislation. It helps us to challenge ourselves and helps others to challenge us when developing it. So the intention always is to get the best outcome for children and young people. And the CRIA is a tool to do that. The CRIA in itself is not the end. The outcome is the end. The CRIA is only a means to an end. The other thing that the CRIA does, I told you it did two things. One, it focuses the mind, but the other thing it does is it shows that Welsh Government have complied with the duty. It actually is our evidence. Because if Welsh ministers don't comply with the duty, there is always the risk of them being taken to judicial review. So ministers could end up in court for not complying with their duty, which is right, but how do we prove it? How do we then say ministers have complied with their duty? And we do this. I mean, this is how we would do this. The CRIA would provide that evidence and provide that proof that this has been done to the best that it can be. When we're doing all this, it doesn't mean that we can give everything that we would want to children and young people. There's resources issues here, there's resource issues in Wales. So it's not about giving children and young people everything that they might desire or want or need. It's just not possible always. But one of the things that the CRIA might do is help you to mitigate as much as possible the negative effects, or to think about how you could maybe change something or do something a bit differently that might have a more positive effect. So it's a tool to make you think and to challenge yourself, to challenge others, to challenge the government, to challenge ministers. Let me see where I'm at. So what is the CRIA? It has 6 steps here. The first step is saying what the piece of work is. The next step is the analysis. And I skipped over the first one quite quickly there. It is what it is. The piece of work is what it is. The focus of the 6 steps is on the second part, the analysis of the impact. In fact, if I moved on quite quickly, number 5 and number 6 are quite administrative. So they're just saying, what do you do with the CRIA afterwards? Where do you save it? Where do you send it? How does the minister know about it? How would you get the minister to agree it? So they're the process. But really, where I want to focus is on number 2 and number 3, the analysis of the impact. And in any CRIA that we see, typically, number 1, number 5, number 6 tend to be quite short, and the majority of the written stuff is always in number 2 and number 3. In our CRIA template, which we developed, which we're very happy to share with anybody, there are prompts. So it's not that people actually are expected to know what to do automatically without any guidance or support from the likes of me and my team. So just to pick out a couple, what are the positive and negative impacts for children and people and their families? How are you improving the way children and people access their rights? What aspects of children's lives will be affected by the proposal? Does the piece of work help to maximise the outcomes within the articles of the UNCRC? And if not, have any alternatives to the current piece of work been considered? Consider the wider impact. Does the proposal affect any other policy? So these are some of the prompts that will help, hopefully, to make better policy and better legislations. And it's all set out in our children's rights impact in our children's rights scheme that, again, provides the transparency, hopefully, that's needed. I just hear saying that there is a flow chart that we use to take people through it. So again, it's not from lack of will that civil servants or government workers don't do careers, it's from not knowing how to. So we've actually provided flow charts to make it easier for people to know exactly how to do it and when to do it. And I'm not sure you can see it in the back, but they're quite detailed. They look a little bit like that. There's one for legislation, one for bills, one for statutory instruments, and one for everything else government does. So again, just trying to make it easy for people to comply, and comply meaningfully. We have to report on compliance every 5 years, but actually 5 years is an awful long time, so we've committed to do it every 2.5. And of course, as I said before, we do publish all our CREAs. So while the duty is on ministers, those of you who work for government will know that actually government workers and civil servants do a lot of this work on behalf of ministers. So this slide probably is more for people who work for government, but decisions taken by ministers are more likely to need a formal children's rights impact assessment. And actually, the duty by default is on also workers for the government. I've already mentioned a lot of those things there. I just wanted to, before asking you about any questions, I wanted to pick up on something that was raised before. Yes, it's very nice to have legislation. It's lovely to have CREAs, but so what? What difference does it make? So I thought maybe I could give you a couple of quick examples of things that have happened in Wales and the way that policy has been developed to kind of really focus on children and people. There, of course, is specific programmes, projects and legislation that is to do with children. So we have things like Team Around the Family. So instead of now of Team Around the Child, it's a team around the family to try and keep that child within that family and to try and address things like poverty as well. Take a wider look at it. An example is always in school, they teach children people to eat healthily, but actually children don't buy the food in the house, do they? So, it's about dealing with a whole family approach, and therefore you actually do affect and have a positive effect on children's rights in that way. Flying Start, providing childcare and health visitors, intensive health visitors for children under 3 years old in deprived areas. Again, trying to give those in the deprived areas the most positive and best start in life. And then early education and learning through play, giving children and people the best start in life, but also letting them be creative, letting them use their imagination. And the other things I want to talk about is things that you wouldn't necessarily link to children. In some of the presentations, we've been talking about children's policies. In Wales, we don't talk about children's policies. We talk about policies. We don't talk about children's legislations. We talk about legislation. Because, in fact, you could argue that any legislation or any policy has an effect on children and people. We've been really trying hard to think of policies that don't have an effect on children and people, and we think we came up with fisheries and fly tipping, I think, which is just throwing rubbish away in the countryside. So there's very few policies and legislation that doesn't have an effect on children and people. So if you build houses without a place to play, then actually that contravenes the UNCRC. So housing policy, housing legislation needs to consider children's rights. If you build a factory next to a school, then you're going to increase traffic, you're going to affect pollution. So actually the economy and economy policies have an effect on children and people. Domestic abuse, we've just passed the domestic abuse legislation in Wales, and in fact, it was very, very focused on women, where we know also men suffer domestic abuse, but actually it didn't consider the child. And, if a child or a woman was to go to a refuge, they could take their children with them, but not boys. So women weren't going to refuges. And so it's about kind of changing that and thinking about all kinds of legislation. I guess one that you wouldn't necessarily think about is the human transplant legislation that we've just done in Wales. So instead of opting in to donate your organs in Wales, you have to opt out. So all of you would, if you lived in Wales, would be donating your organs if you hadn't actually logged onto the computer and opted out of it. But the age was 18, and then under 18, your parents had to do it on your behalf. And children people were telling us, well, hang on, I can get married, I can join the armed forces, you know, I can do all of these things, I can get a job, I can leave school, but I can't say if I want to donate my organs or not. So because of that, and because they work through the CRIA, and because in the CRIA it tells them that they need to talk to children and young people, that changed. And actually now it's actually gone down to 16 and might go down again. So it shows you how it translates to being a real thing and more than just legislation or a piece of paper. Thank you very much.